There is a man standing at the edge of a crowd. He is not throwing stones. That detail matters. He is standing just outside the circle, holding a pile of coats, watching. The men who took their coats off to throw more freely handed them to him, and he took them. He is young, educated, trained in the finest tradition his world has to offer, and he is standing there, coats in his arms, watching a man named Stephen die. Stephen is not dying quietly. He is looking up, saying he can see heaven open, saying he sees the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. The crowd finds this unbearable. The stones keep coming, and the young man at the edge keeps holding the coats. His name is Saul, and if you had told him in that moment that he would spend the rest of his life fighting for people who were told they did not belong, he would not have understood what you were talking about. He was not having a crisis of conscience at the edge of that crowd. He believed he was doing the right thing. He was there because he thought Stephen deserved it. That is where this story begins. Not with a letter, not with a theological argument, with a man holding coats at an execution, completely certain he was on the right side. 20 years later, that same man would write one of the most consequential documents in human history, a letter about who gets to belong to God. A letter so urgent he skipped the pleasantries entirely and went straight to the point. A letter that would shape the way billions of people understood faith, freedom, and what it means to be accepted. But before we read that letter, we need to understand the man who wrote it. And to understand him, we have to start here, at the edge of that crowd, with the coats in his arms, and the question that would follow him for the rest of his life, whether he knew it yet or not. What do you do when everything you were certain about turns out to be wrong? Saul of Tarsus was not a complicated man in his early years. He was a man with a clear mission, and that is almost always more dangerous. He grew up in Tarsus, a major city in what is now southern Turkey. But he was educated in Jerusalem under a rabbi named Gamaliel, one of the most respected Jewish teachers of the first century. This was not a minor credential. Gamaliel was the kind of teacher whose students went on to shape the intellectual and religious life of their generation. Saul was, by his own account, advancing in the study of his ancestral traditions beyond most of his peers. He was gifted, disciplined, and completely devoted to what he understood as the will of God. To understand what drove him, you have to understand something about the world he grew up in. The Jewish people in the first century were living under Roman occupation. The temple still stood in Jerusalem, which meant the religious life of Israel was still functioning. But everything around it was Roman. Roman governors, Roman soldiers, Roman taxes, Roman courts, and everywhere, the constant grinding reality that the people of God were not free in the land God had given them. For many Jews in that world, the response to this situation was to hold more tightly to what made them distinctly Jewish: the Torah, the traditions, the boundaries that separated the people of the covenant from everyone else. Because if those boundaries dissolved, if the distinctiveness of Israel was absorbed into the surrounding Roman world, then what was left? This was not paranoia. This was a lesson written into Jewish history in blood. Less than 2 centuries before Saul was born, a Greek king named Antiochus IV had done something that left a permanent mark on Jewish memory. He had tried to force the Jewish people to abandon their traditions. He had desecrated the temple. He had made the practice of Jewish law punishable by death. And the response, the event that Jewish people still celebrate at Hanukkah, was a violent uprising led by a family called the Maccabees. The hero of that uprising was a man named Mattathias. And the first thing Mattathias did was not attack the Greek soldiers. He killed a Jewish man who was about to offer a pagan sacrifice in public compliance with the Greek king's demands. He killed him because he saw a Jew compromising the boundaries of his people, and he decided that could not be allowed to stand. That act was celebrated. It was remembered as righteous. It became part of the story of what faithfulness looked like when everything was on the line. The word for this kind of fierce, boundary-protecting devotion was zeal. And zeal had a long tradition in Israel. Phinehas, in the book of Numbers, stopped a plague by driving a spear through an Israelite man who had taken a foreign wife and was worshipping foreign gods. Eliah, standing against 450 prophets of Baal, had them all killed in a single afternoon. These men were not remembered as violent extremists. They were remembered as heroes, men who loved God enough to do what softer people would not do. This was one stream within a larger and diverse Jewish world. Most Jewish people in the first century were not violent zealots. Most were farmers and merchants and teachers and parents trying to live faithfully in a complicated world. But this stream, the tradition of zealous boundary keeping, was real, and it was honored. And Saul had absorbed it completely. He was zealous for the traditions of his ancestors beyond most of his contemporaries. He had been advancing in his commitment to the boundaries and distinctives of his people faster than almost anyone around him. And then the movement around Jesus of Nazareth began to spread. From Saul's perspective, this movement was exactly the kind of boundary-dissolving threat that zeal was designed to address. Here was a group of Jews claiming that a man executed by the Romans as a criminal was actually the Messiah. They were gathering in synagogues. They were spreading their message into diaspora communities scattered across the Roman world. And most alarmingly, they were beginning to include people who were not Jewish at all, people who had not taken on the identity and practice of Israel, and treating them as fully part of the community of God's people. That last part was the problem Saul could not accept. The claim that the boundaries that defined Israel could be crossed without crossing them. That someone could be on the inside without doing the things that put you on the inside. He began arresting people, going house to house, dragging men and women out and handing them over to be imprisoned. By his own account, he tried to force them to blaspheme. He voted for their execution when votes were taken. And when a man named Stephen stood before the council and gave a speech that the council found blasphemous, Saul was there, watching, holding the coats. Here is what most retellings of this story miss. Saul was not a cruel man enjoying the suffering of others. He was a man who genuinely believed he was protecting something sacred. He was doing exactly what Phinehas had done, exactly what Mattathias had done, exactly what the heroes of his tradition had done when they saw the boundaries of God's people threatened. He was being zealous. And in his world, zeal was not a character flaw. It was a virtue. That is the most unsettling thing about Saul of Tarsus, before Damascus. The people who cause the most damage in history are rarely the ones who know they are doing wrong. They are the ones who are completely certain they are doing right. Certainty without humility is one of the most dangerous forces a human being can carry. And Saul carried it with full conviction. He was heading to Damascus to continue his work when something happened that he spent the rest of his life trying to put into words. And even then, he never quite managed it. The road to Damascus is about 135 miles from Jerusalem, on foot or by horse. That is roughly a week of travel, a week of moving through the landscape of ancient Syria, through towns and villages and stretches of open country, with enough time to think. Saul would have had plenty of time to think. He was traveling with a purpose, carrying letters from the high priest that gave him authority to arrest followers of Jesus in the Damascus synagogues and bring them back to Jerusalem in chains. He knew what he was going to do when he got there. He had done it before. Find the people, identify the leaders, make the arrests, bring them back. He never made it to Damascus. What happened on that road has been described, analyzed, argued over, and written about for 2,000 years. Paul himself refers to it multiple times in his letters, always briefly, always with the sense that the full reality of it exceeds what language can hold. Luke describes it 3 times in the book of Acts. with slight variations in each account that scholars have spent considerable energy trying to reconcile. What they all agree on is this: there was a light. It was overwhelming, far beyond what the midday sun of Syria could produce. Saul fell to the ground, and then there was a voice. The voice asked a question that stopped him completely. Not a threat, not a command, a question. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Saul asked who was speaking, and the answer was, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Two things about that answer would have hit Saul simultaneously, and the collision between them would have been staggering. The first was the obvious one. The man he had dismissed as a dead criminal executed by Rome was apparently not simply dead. Whatever Saul had assumed about what happened to Jesus of Nazareth, this moment was forcing a complete revision of that assumption in real time. Under circumstances he had no framework to explain. But the second thing was in some ways more devastating. The voice did not say, "Why are you persecuting my followers?" It said, "Why are you persecuting me?" Jesus was identifying himself completely with the people Saul had been arresting, the people Saul had dragged from their homes, the people he had voted to execute, the people whose coats he had held while they were stoned. When Saul hurt them, he was hurting Jesus. That was what the voice was saying. And if that was true, then every act of zeal that Saul had performed in the name of protecting the people of God had been an act of violence against the one he was supposedly protecting them for. The certainty that had carried him to Damascus dissolved in that moment. Not gradually. All at once. He stood up and he could not see. 3 days. That is how long the blindness lasted. 3 days in Damascus. In the house of a man named Judas, on a street called Straight. Not eating, not drinking, not able to see anything. 3 days with nothing to do but sit with what had just happened to him. We do not know what Saul thought during those 3 days. The text does not tell us. What we can say is this: Saul was lying in the dark in a city he had come to as a hunter. He had come to Damascus with authority and purpose and the backing of the high priest in Jerusalem. He was going to walk into that city and take people. And instead he was lying in someone's house, unable to see, being cared for by strangers, completely dependent on the kindness of people he did not know. That inversion is not a small thing. Saul had spent his career putting people in exactly this kind of position. Helpless, dependent, stripped of their ability to move and act and determine what happened next. And now he was in it. Not as a theological lesson he was reading about, but as a physical reality he was living inside. And then a man named Ananias came to find him. Ananias was a follower of Jesus in Damascus. He was, by Saul's former definition, exactly the kind of person Saul had been traveling to arrest. When Jesus told Ananias in a vision to go find Saul, Ananias pushed back. He had heard about this man. He knew what Saul had done in Jerusalem. He knew why Saul had come to Damascus. He went anyway. He walked into that room where Saul was sitting in the dark, and he said 2 words. "Brother Saul." Brother. The first word spoken to Saul after 3 days of blindness was not an accusation. It was not a confrontation. It was not the word of someone who had every reason to be afraid of this man and every reason to want nothing to do with him. It was brother. Ananias placed his hands on Saul and said that Jesus had sent him so that Saul could regain his sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. The first human face Saul saw after Damascus was the face of a man he would have arrested a week earlier. That moment, more than the light and the voice on the road, is the one that tells you something essential about what was being asked of Saul. A complete reconstruction of who counted as a neighbor, who counted as a brother, who was on the inside of the story he was living. He had built his entire identity around knowing who was in and who was out. And the person who came to restore his sight was someone he had put on the outside. He got up, ate, and was baptized. And then he went to Damascus. And that is where things got complicated very quickly. The people who had been his allies, the Jewish community in Damascus, who had expected him to arrive and begin making arrests, found out what had happened on the road. They could not accept it. A man who had come to Damascus to destroy the Jesus movement was now preaching in their synagogues that Jesus was the Son of God. They decided he had to die. They watched the city gates day and night, waiting for him to leave so they could kill him. Saul found out about the plan, and what happened next is one of the strangest, most undignified scenes in the entire story of the early church. His new friends in Damascus, the people he had come to arrest, took him to a section of the city wall at night. They put him in a large basket, and they lowered him down through a window in the wall, like cargo being unloaded from a ship. The man who had arrived in Damascus, carrying the authority of the high priest, confident and powerful and certain, left the city in a basket in the dark. He made it out. But think about what that moment cost him on the inside. He had left his old world completely. The people he used to stand with wanted him dead, and the people he now stood with were hiding him in a basket because that was the only way to keep him alive. He was not between two worlds. He was outside both of them. He needed somewhere to go, somewhere to think, somewhere to be nobody for a while, away from the pressure of what had just happened and what it meant and what he was supposed to do with it. He went to Arabia. Paul tells us almost nothing about Arabia. In the letter to the Galatians, he mentions it in a single sentence. After Damascus, he says, he did not go up to Jerusalem to consult with the apostles. He went away into Arabia, and then returned to Damascus. That is it. One sentence, accounting for what he later clarifies, was a period of 3 years. 3 years. In those 3 years, Paul did not write any letters that survived. He did not give any speeches that were recorded. He did not make any converts whose stories are told. He simply was in Arabia, and then he was not. The silence is remarkable when you consider what came before and what came after. Before Arabia, a man who arrived in a city in a basket at night, hunted by his former allies, uncertain what came next. After Arabia, the same man would walk into city after city across the Roman world and tell anyone who would listen that the God of Israel had done something in Jesus Christ that opened the story of Israel to people who had never been part of it, that there was no longer any barrier. That belonging was not earned by marking your body with the sign of the covenant. That faith was enough, and faith was available to everyone. Something happened in Arabia that accounts for the distance between those two versions of the same man. The text does not tell us what it was, and the honest thing to do with that silence is not to fill it but to let it be what it is. A gap. A 3-year gap in the biography of the most important letter writer in the history of the church. What we can say is this: Paul himself counted Arabia as part of the story of his gospel. He brought it up in Galatians, specifically in the context of defending where his message came from, arguing that it did not come from other human beings, that it was not something handed to him by the Jerusalem apostles or developed through consultation with people who had known Jesus. Arabia was part of his evidence that what he was preaching was not borrowed from anyone else, which means the silence of Arabia was not the silence of someone hiding. It was the silence of someone doing something that mattered enormously and could not be done in public. We cannot watch what happened inside Paul during those 3 years. We can only see the man who went in and the man who came out, and the distance between them is, in its own way, as dramatic as the light on the road. What we do know is what he was carrying when he left Damascus in that basket. He was carrying the memory of Stephen, the memory of all the people he had arrested, the memory of what he had been doing and why he had been doing it, and the knowledge that he had been wrong in a way that caused real harm to real people. That is not the kind of weight you work through in a week. That is not the kind of thing that gets resolved by a single dramatic encounter on a road. He was also carrying an entirely new understanding of who Jesus was and what that meant. an understanding that had arrived in a flash of light and collapsed his previous framework completely, and now needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Not just the theological framework, the entire structure of meaning that had organized his life. Arabia was the place where Saul of Tarsus stopped moving long enough to reckon with all of it. When he came back from Arabia, he eventually went up to Jerusalem for the first time since his life had changed. He spent 15 days there. He saw Peter. He saw James, the brother of Jesus. He saw almost no one else. 15 days. That is a notably short visit for a man who had just spent 3 years working through the most significant transformation of his life. The text does not explain why the visit was so short. It does not tell us what those 15 days were like. What was said, what was not said. How Peter looked at him across a table knowing what this man had done. How Paul sat with the knowledge of what he had done to people who were now their shared brothers and sisters. It only tells us he was there for 15 days and then he left. Some silences tell you more than any amount of explanation could. But here is the one thing that Arabia and Jerusalem and the basket at the wall all have in common. At every point after Damascus, the people who received Paul were people he had once considered the enemy. The man who called him brother in Damascus. The community that lowered him in a basket. The apostles who gave him 15 days in Jerusalem when they had every reason to give him nothing. They kept calling him brother. And he kept carrying that word with him. Into Arabia. Back to Damascus. Into Jerusalem. And eventually into Galatia, where he would preach to people who had never been fully inside anything, and tell them that they too were brothers and sisters, that they too belonged. He knew what it meant to be called brother by someone who had every reason not to. He had lived it. And that experience, more than any argument about Abraham or Torah or circumcision, is the ground from which the letter to the Galatians grew. Paul did not plan to go to Galatia. That is not how the story is usually told. But it is what the text actually says. In the letter itself, Paul reminds the Galatians of the circumstances under which he first came to them. It was because of a bodily ailment. He writes that he preached the gospel to them at first. He was sick. His body failed him at the wrong moment. Or perhaps the right one, depending on how you look at it. He could not continue on to wherever he had been heading. He had to stop, and he stopped in Galatia. Before we follow him into those communities, it is worth understanding what Galatia actually was. Not the geography, but the human reality of it. Galatia was a Roman province in the central part of what is now Turkey. It was not a prestigious address. It was not Athens, where the great philosophical traditions had taken root. It was not Corinth, the commercial hub of the ancient Mediterranean world. It was not Antioch, one of the largest cities in the empire. Galatia was inland, home to a mixed population that included descendants of Celtic tribes who had migrated into the region centuries earlier, alongside local populations and Roman settlers. The Jewish communities in the Galatian cities were part of the wide diaspora network scattered across the Roman world. These were people living at a significant distance from Jerusalem, maintaining their traditions in a context that was not designed to support those traditions. They gathered in synagogues, observed the Sabbath, kept the food laws as best they could, taught their children the stories of Israel. But they were doing all of this surrounded by a world that operated on entirely different assumptions. And then there were the Gentiles who had found their way into the orbit of those Jewish communities without becoming fully Jewish. People drawn to the ethical monotheism of Judaism, who attended synagogue, who found the Jewish understanding of God more compelling than the crowded pantheon of Greek and Roman religion, but who had not taken the full step of conversion. They were interested. They were present. They were not fully in. Picture one of them on an ordinary Sabbath morning. He walks to the synagogue. He sits where the visitors sit, not where the members sit. He listens to the reading, He hears the promises of God spoken over a people he is adjacent to but not quite part of. He goes home. He comes back the next week. And the week after that. Always in the same seat. Always adjacent. Always almost in but not quite. And with no clear path to crossing that last distance. That is the world Paul landed in when his body gave out in Galatia. He was not at his best. Whatever the ailment was, and scholars have proposed everything from malaria to severe eye trouble, to the recurring condition he elsewhere calls a thorn in his flesh. It was enough to make him physically difficult to be around. He mentions this himself. He says that despite the trial his condition presented, the Galatians did not scorn or despise him. He says they received him as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus himself. Think about that description from the perspective of the people doing the receiving. Here is a man who arrives in their community sick, clearly not at the height of his powers, unable to simply move on to wherever he was going. He is not coming as a celebrated figure with an impressive reputation. He is coming as someone who needs to stop, who needs care, who has no choice but to rely on the hospitality of people he has never met. And he starts talking. Whatever Paul said to those communities in Galatia during that time, it landed with a force that he himself found remarkable when he looked back on it. He would later remind them that they had been willing to tear out their own eyes and give them to him, if that had been possible. That is the language of people who felt they had received something they had been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. What was it? The message Paul brought to Galatia was the same message he brought everywhere. But in Galatia, it was landing with people who had a particular hunger for it. These were people who existed in a kind of permanent in-between, close enough to the Jewish community to know the story of Israel, to be drawn to the God of Israel, to want to be part of something that felt true and good and ancient, but not fully in. There were steps they had not taken, boundaries they had not crossed, a distance between where they were and where full membership would require them to go. And Paul was telling them that the distance had been closed, not by them taking more steps, but by something that had already happened, something accomplished in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, something that had restructured the relationship between God and human beings in a way that did not leave them permanently at the door. You do not have to become someone else to belong. That was the message. And for people who had spent years being told in 100 subtle and not-so-subtle ways that they were almost there but not quite, that they were welcome to observe but not to fully participate, that they were close but still outside. That message was not a minor theological adjustment. It was the difference between being a permanent guest and being told for the first time that this is your house too. Paul stayed long enough to see something take root. Communities formed. People who had never been fully inside anything found themselves inside something together. They ate together, which in that world was not a casual act but a statement of shared belonging. They prayed together. They cared for each other in the practical ways that small communities care for each other when they decide they are responsible for one another. And then Paul left. Because he always left. He was a traveler. A man with more cities to reach than any one city could hold him. He left behind communities that were, by any external measure, fragile. They had no powerful patrons. They had no institutional backing. They were small groups of people meeting in houses, mostly without wealth or social influence, held together by a shared conviction about something that had happened in a distant province of the empire some years earlier. But they were communities where people who had never fully belonged anywhere had found a place to belong. And that, it turned out, was both their greatest strength and the thing that would make them a target. Because belonging, once experienced, creates a vulnerability that nothing else quite creates. When you have never belonged, you have nothing to lose. When you have finally found a place where you are in, the fear of being pushed back out can make you do things that the security of belonging would never require. Someone was coming to Galatia who understood that fear very well, and they were going to use it. We do not know their names. Paul does not give them to us. And the text of Galatians never identifies these figures in any way that would allow us to connect them to known individuals. They are simply the people who came to the Galatian communities after Paul left and began teaching something different. Paul calls them the ones who are troubling you, the ones who want to distort the gospel, the ones who are compelling you to be circumcised. That last phrase is the key. Whatever else these teachers were saying, the practical point they were pressing was this: for Gentile men in the Galatian communities to be fully part of the people of God, they needed to be circumcised, and they needed to take on observance of the Jewish law. This was not a fringe position. It was a position with serious theological weight behind it. And understanding why requires understanding something that modern readers often miss. The story of Israel in the Hebrew Scriptures is not primarily a story about individuals finding personal salvation. It is a story about a people. God called Abraham. God made a covenant with Abraham and his descendants. The sign of that covenant, from Abraham onward, was circumcision. It was the physical mark that said this person is part of the covenant community. This person is inside the story. When the movement around Jesus began, it began entirely within Judaism. The first followers of Jesus were Jewish. The first communities were formed in synagogues. The scriptures they read were the Hebrew scriptures. The God they worshipped was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The story they understood themselves to be living inside was the story of Israel. And when Gentiles began joining these communities, a question arose that nobody had a clean, prepackaged answer to: how do you join the story of Israel if you are not from Israel? The scriptures had always imagined that one day the nations would come to the God of Israel. But the scriptures had also assumed that coming to the God of Israel meant, in some meaningful sense, coming to Israel, taking on the identity, accepting the covenant, bearing the mark. The people troubling the Galatians were not inventing a position from nothing. They were applying a logic that had deep roots in the tradition. If you want to be part of the covenant people, you need the covenant sign. If you want to be inside the story, you need to enter the story the way the story has always required people to enter it. Their argument probably sounded something like this: Paul came to you and told you the good news about Jesus. And that was true and good. But Paul only gave you part of the picture. He is not telling you everything you need to know. The leaders in Jerusalem, the people who actually knew Jesus, the people who have the full picture, they understand that faith in Jesus is the beginning, not the whole story. To be fully part of what God is doing, you need to take the step that every member of that community has always taken. Otherwise, you are still on the outside looking in. Now here is the question that the text of Galatians does not answer directly, but that is essential to understand what happened next. Why did the Galatians listen? These were people who had found belonging in the communities Paul had formed. They had heard a message that told them the distance was closed, that they did not have to become someone else to be inside. They had experienced community and table fellowship, and the particular warmth of a group of people who have decided they are responsible for each other. Why would they be open to a message that seemed to be introducing conditions back into something that had been presented as unconditional? The answer is uncomfortable, because it is so recognizable. Freedom is harder to live in than it sounds. When Paul told the Galatians they belonged by faith, that there was no additional requirement, that they were in, he was telling them something beautiful. He was also telling them something that left them without a clear set of markers to determine where the edges were. If anyone with faith belongs, how do you know who is in your community? How do you know what you are supposed to do? How do you know if you are doing it right? How do you know if you are still in tomorrow? The people who came after Paul were offering something that addressed all of those questions. Circumcision is a clear marker. Either you have done it or you have not. Keeping the law gives you a set of practices that structure your daily life and connect you visibly to the community you belong to. There is comfort in that kind of clarity. There is security in knowing exactly where the lines are and knowing that you are on the right side of them. There is also something else going on. Something Paul identifies with unusual directness in the letter. He says these teachers want to make a good showing in the flesh. He says they are compelling the Galatians to be circumcised so that the community will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. He is suggesting that part of the motivation behind this push is social pressure from the broader Jewish world around them. Communities that included circumcised Gentile men were more acceptable, less threatening to the social order than communities that included uncircumcised Gentile men claiming full membership in what was supposed to be a Jewish movement. In other words, the pressure the Galatians were feeling was not just internal. It was coming from the world around them, from the very human desire to not be on the wrong side of the lines that the people around you have drawn. Paul had spent his life drawing those lines. He knew exactly what they felt like from the inside. And now he was watching a community he had built from a position of personal weakness being slowly convinced to redraw them, to put the people he had told were fully in back on the other side of a boundary they had not been able to cross on their own. He was not going to stay quiet about it. But before we get to the letter, we need to go to a dinner table in Antioch. Because what happened at that table is the moment that made everything Paul would write in Galatians not just a theological argument, but a personal reckoning with something he had watched happen in front of his own eyes. A table where someone stood up and walked away, and left people sitting there, watching, understanding exactly what that meant without a single word being spoken. Before the table at Antioch, there was a meeting in Jerusalem. Paul describes it in Galatians with the careful precision of someone reconstructing an event that still matters to him years later. He went up to Jerusalem, he says, by revelation. Not because he was summoned, not because the Jerusalem leaders sent for him. He went because he believed he was supposed to go. He took Barnabas with him, and he also took Titus. Titus was a Greek man, uncircumcised, a Gentile who had come to faith through Paul's preaching and was now traveling with Paul as a co-worker in the mission. He was, in the most literal sense, the living embodiment of everything the coming argument would be about. Picture that scene for a moment. Paul walks into Jerusalem with this man at his side, not hiding him, not apologizing for him, bringing him directly into the room where the leaders of the movement would be deciding what to do about the question of Gentile inclusion. Titus is not a hypothetical. He is standing right there. Paul met privately with the leaders. He laid out the gospel he had been preaching among the Gentiles. He wanted to make sure, he says, that he was not running or had not run in vain. That phrase is often read as uncertainty, as if Paul was not sure whether his message was correct and needed the Jerusalem leaders to validate it. But reading the rest of Galatians makes clear that is not what he means. Paul is not asking permission. He is making sure that the two expressions of the movement are not going to end up working at cross purposes in ways that would damage both. The people he met with are described in Galatians with a phrase that carries a slight edge: those who seem to be influential, those who seem to be pillars. James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, John. Paul uses that word "seem" twice, which is a choice. He is not dismissing their authority. He is noting that authority in the kingdom of God does not work the same way authority works in the kingdoms of men. What happened in that private meeting? Paul says they added nothing to him. The pillars of the Jerusalem church heard what Paul was preaching and did not require him to change anything. Crucially, they did not insist that Titus be circumcised. The Greek man standing in the room walked out of that room exactly as he had walked in. They recognized the grace that had been given to Paul and extended to him and Barnabas, the right hand of fellowship. They agreed, essentially, to a division of labor. Paul would focus on the Gentiles. Peter would focus on the Jewish communities. Both were legitimate expressions of the same gospel. The movement was large enough for both. That is the official account of the Jerusalem meeting. And it matters. It represents a genuine moment of recognition across what could have been a permanent divide. But the official account is not the whole story. Because Paul also mentions, almost in passing, that there were false brothers, as he calls them, who had slipped in to spy out the freedom that he and his companions had in Christ, with the aim of bringing them into slavery. These people were at the meeting, or at least present in Jerusalem during this period, and they were pushing hard for Titus to be circumcised. Paul says he did not yield to them for even a moment. So the Jerusalem meeting was not the clean, unified moment of agreement that a surface reading might suggest. Underneath the handshake between Paul and the pillars, there was a faction pressing for exactly what the troublemakers in Galatia would later press for. The question had not been settled. It had been managed, for the moment, by the authority of the main leaders. But the people who disagreed had not gone away. They were watching. They were waiting. To understand why the Jerusalem problem was so complicated, you have to sit with the genuine difficulty of the position the Jerusalem leaders were in. James, the brother of Jesus, was leading a community of Jewish believers in Jerusalem. These were people who continued to observe Torah, who attended the temple, who were recognizable to their Jewish neighbors as Jews who had added a particular conviction about Jesus to their existing practice. They were not trying to leave Judaism. They were trying to live within it while holding to something new. That position required constant negotiation with the broader Jewish world around them. Too much association with Gentile communities that were not keeping the law. Too much public identification with people who were blurring the boundaries that defined Israel. And the Jerusalem community would find itself on the wrong side of the social and religious lines that structured their world. They were already in a fragile position. They did not need additional reasons for their neighbors to see them as a threat to everything that Jewish identity had been built on. From where James stood, asking Gentile converts to take on circumcision and Torah observance was not adding an unnecessary burden to people who did not need it. It was maintaining the coherence of a covenant that had held Israel together for centuries. It was saying that the God of Israel, who had called a particular people and given them a particular identity and a particular sign of that identity, was still the same God, and that the arrival of the Messiah did not erase what the Messiah had come to fulfill. That is a serious position. It deserves to be taken seriously. From where Paul stood, however, the logic worked in the opposite direction. The entire point of what had happened in Christ was that the barrier between God and human beings had been addressed. Not patched. Not managed. Addressed. If that was true, then adding circumcision as a requirement for Gentile inclusion was not preserving the covenant. It was saying that Christ had not actually done what Paul was claiming Christ had done. Two serious positions. Two ways of reading the same story. Two understandings of what the Messiah's arrival meant for the shape of God's people going forward. The Jerusalem meeting produced a handshake but not a resolution. The underlying tension was still there, and it was about to come to the surface in a way that nobody in that private meeting could have predicted. It was going to come to the surface at a dinner table, and the person who was going to sit down at that table and then stand up and walk away was Peter himself. Antioch was the third largest city in the Roman Empire. Only Rome and Alexandria were larger. It sat at the junction of major trade routes, on the Orontes River in what is now southern Turkey near the Syrian border, and it had a population somewhere in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from across the Mediterranean world. It was the kind of city where Greek culture and Roman administration and Eastern traditions all existed in the same streets, sometimes uncomfortably close together. The Jesus community in Antioch was different from the one in Jerusalem in ways that mattered enormously. In Jerusalem, the movement had grown up inside the Jewish community and stayed close to it. In Antioch, something new had happened. Followers of Jesus, some of them Jewish and some of them not, had begun gathering together across the lines that normally kept those two groups separate. They had begun eating together. They had begun living as if the boundary that separated Jew and Gentile in the social and religious world of the first century was no longer the most important thing about them. It was in Antioch that followers of Jesus were first called Christians. That is not a coincidence. The label appeared in a place where the movement had become something that observers could not easily categorize within existing frameworks. Something new enough that it needed a new name. Into this community. Sometime after the Jerusalem meeting, came Peter. Peter was the most prominent figure in the early movement after James. He had been one of the first disciples, one of the inner circle, the man Jesus had called the Rock. He had been present at the crucifixion and the resurrection. He had enormous authority, the kind of authority that came not from a position assigned to him by an institution, but from the simple fact that he had been there, that he had seen things that no one else had seen. He also had history with the question of Gentile inclusion that made his presence in Antioch significant. Some years earlier, Peter had received a vision. In the vision, a sheet descended from heaven containing all kinds of animals, and a voice told him to kill and eat. When he objected on the grounds that he had never eaten anything impure or unclean, the voice told him that what God had made clean, he should not call impure. This happened 3 times. And then, immediately after the vision, messengers arrived from a Roman centurion named Cornelius, asking him to come to the centurion's house. Peter went. He ate with Cornelius and his household. He shared the message about Jesus, and he watched the Holy Spirit fall on people who had not been circumcised, who were not Jewish, who had no prior connection to the covenant of Israel. He baptized them. He went back to Jerusalem and defended his actions to the community there. This is the man who came to Antioch and began eating with the Gentile believers. He was not doing something new. He had done it before. He had seen what happened when the lines were crossed in the direction of inclusion. In Antioch, he was simply continuing what he had already understood and already practiced. For a while, then certain people came from James. Paul does not tell us exactly who these people were or precisely what they said when they arrived. He tells us what happened after they arrived. Peter, who had been eating with the Gentile believers, began to draw back. He began to separate himself. He was afraid. Paul says, of those of the circumcision party, read that sequence slowly, because the drama in it is easy to miss if you move through it too quickly. Peter was not confronted with a theological argument that he could not answer. He was not presented with evidence that changed his understanding. He was not convinced by superior reasoning that he had been wrong to eat with the Gentiles. He was afraid. He saw people arrive who had connections to Jerusalem, who represented a perspective he understood, and the social pressure of their presence was enough to make him change his behavior. He did not announce that he was changing his behavior. He did not explain himself to the people he was leaving at the table. He simply began to pull back, to separate himself, to find reasons to be somewhere else when the meals that crossed the old lines were happening. He moved from one table to another, and then Barnabas followed him. This is the detail that Paul includes with what feels like particular pain, because Barnabas was not just a fellow traveler. Barnabas was the man who had vouched for Paul when no one else would. After Damascus, when Paul had tried to join the community in Jerusalem and everyone was afraid of him, still convinced he was a spy, Barnabas was the one who brought him in. Barnabas was the bridge between the old Paul and the new one, the human relationship that made the transition possible. And, in Antioch, Barnabas was led astray, as Paul puts it, by the same fear that had moved Peter. The Gentile believers were still sitting at their table, watching. You do not need someone to tell you that you do not belong. Sometimes they only need to stand up and walk to a different table. The message arrives without a single word being spoken. It lands in the body before it reaches the mind. The people still sitting there felt it, the way anyone feels it when the person they respected has decided, quietly and without explanation, that being seen with them is no longer something they are willing to risk. Paul looked at what was happening and did something that cost him something real. He opposed Peter to his face. In front of everyone. Not in a private conversation. Not in a careful diplomatic exchange designed to preserve relationships and avoid public embarrassment. He stood up and said directly to Peter, in front of the whole community, you are not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. Think about what that moment required. Peter was the most prominent figure in the movement. He had authority that Paul did not have and could never have in the same way, because he had been there in ways Paul had not been. To publicly challenge Peter was to invite a response that could have ended Paul's standing in the broader community entirely. It was not a safe thing to do. But Paul had been at the edge of a crowd once before, holding coats, watching something wrong happen and saying nothing. He was not going to do that again. His argument to Peter, as he reconstructs it in the letter, goes to the heart of everything. You are a Jew, he says, but you have been living like a Gentile. You know that a person is not made right with God by works of the law but through faith in Jesus Christ. So why are you compelling Gentiles to live like Jews? The word compelling is important. Peter was not standing up and giving a speech, telling Gentiles they needed to change. He was simply moving to a different table. But Paul understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent years thinking about how belonging works, that the act of separation was its own kind of compulsion. When the most respected person in the room decides that the boundary matters more than the relationship, everyone else has to choose which side of the boundary they want to be on. What happened after Paul's confrontation? We do not know. The letter does not tell us. Paul moves directly from the confrontation into the theological argument that forms the heart of Galatians, and we are left without a resolution to the scene in Antioch. We do not know if Peter responded. We do not know if the community sided with Paul or with Peter. We do not know if the division at the table was healed or hardened into something permanent. What we know is that Paul could not let it go. Whatever happened in that room, the argument that had broken out over a dinner table in Antioch became the argument that Paul felt he had to make in writing. To the Galatians, to any community that was facing the same pressure to draw the line back where it used to be. Because in Galatia, the line was being redrawn, and the people on the wrong side of it were the people Paul had told, in his weakest moment, that they were in. He picked up a pen, and he did not start with thank you. Every letter Paul wrote began the same way. Not the same words, but the same structure. He would identify himself as the sender. He would name the recipients. He would offer a greeting, and then, in most of the letters we know from Paul, he would give thanks. He would tell the people he was writing to that he thanked God for them, that he remembered them in his prayers, that he was grateful for what God was doing in their community. He did this with the Corinthians, a community that gave him more grief than almost any other. He did this with the Philippians from a prison cell, writing one of the most joyful letters in the ancient world while under house arrest. He did this with the Thessalonians, with the Romans, with Philemon. Gratitude was not a formality for Paul. It was the ground he stood on before he said anything else. It was his way of reminding himself and his readers that the relationship existed before the argument, that the people he was writing to were not simply an audience for his theology, but human beings he was connected to in ways that mattered. Galatians has no thanksgiving. He names himself. He names the recipients. He offers the standard greeting of grace and peace. And then, without transition, without softening, without any of the relational warmth that opened every other letter he wrote, he goes directly to this. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. The Greek word translated as astonished is thaumazo. It is the word you use when you see something that you cannot process through your normal categories. Something that sits outside the range of what you expected was possible. It is not mild surprise. It is the cognitive experience of watching something happen that your understanding of the world told you should not be able to happen. Paul is astonished. He is not disappointed in the gentle way of a parent who expected better. He is not concerned in the measured way of a leader assessing a difficult situation. He is astonished. The people he had given everything to reach. The people who had received him when he was sick and weak and unable to impress anyone. The people who would have torn out their own eyes for him. Those people were walking away from what he had brought them toward. Something he was convinced would destroy the very thing that had drawn them in. He does not ease into this. He does not build toward it carefully. The astonishment is the first thing out of his mouth after the greeting, and everything that follows in the letter flows from it. But the missing thanksgiving is doing something beyond simply signaling his emotional state. In the world of ancient letter writing, the Thanksgiving section was the place where a writer established the relational foundation for everything that followed. It was the place where you reminded your readers that you were on the same side, that you cared about them, that the argument you were about to make was coming from a place of shared commitment rather than opposition. By skipping it, Paul is not saying he does not care about the Galatians. He is saying that the situation has become so urgent, the departure from what he had brought them so serious, that he cannot in good conscience spend time on relational maintenance before he has addressed what is happening. To open with gratitude in this moment would feel, to him, like arriving at a house fire and asking the homeowner how their week has been before mentioning the flames. There is also something else in the missing thanksgiving that is easy to overlook. Every letter Paul wrote had something to be genuinely thankful for in the community he was addressing. The Corinthians were a mess, but their spiritual gifts were real, and their faith was alive even when their behavior was chaotic. The Philippians had sent him support from prison and demonstrated a partnership in the gospel that moved him deeply. Even communities with serious problems had things Paul could honestly thank God for. What is Paul thankful for in Galatia right now? The question answers itself. He is writing a letter that begins with astonishment and ends with him taking the pen into his own hand to make sure his final words land with physical weight. What is happening in Galatia has taken away the ground that thanksgiving requires. He is not performing coldness. He is being honest about where he is. There is one more dimension of this opening that matters before we move to what comes next. Paul does not say the Galatians are turning away because they have been deceived by clever arguments that were too sophisticated for them to see through. He does not position them as innocent victims of manipulation. He says they are deserting. The word is the word of someone who had a place and has left it. Someone who made a choice to go somewhere else. He holds them responsible for what they are doing even as he is trying to pull them back from it. That combination, astonishment and accountability, is the emotional architecture of the entire letter. Paul is not writing to people he has given up on. He is writing to people he believes are capable of understanding what they are doing and capable of choosing differently. The urgency of the letter is not the urgency of someone who thinks it is too late. It is the urgency of someone who thinks there is still time, but not much of it. He has something to say to them. He believes they can hear it. And he is not going to waste a single word on pleasantries before he starts saying it. Right after the missing thanksgiving, Paul drops two of the most severe words he ever wrote. Twice, in consecutive sentences, he says, anathema. Let anyone who preaches a gospel other than the one we preach to you be accursed. And then, as if once was not enough, as if he needed to make sure there was no ambiguity about whether this applied to edge cases or special circumstances, even if we ourselves, even if an angel from heaven preaches a different gospel, let them be accursed. The word anathema in the Greek world meant something devoted to destruction, something set apart not for honor, but for judgment. In the Jewish tradition, it carried the force of complete exclusion from the community, the severance of every connection. It was not the vocabulary of disagreement. It was not the vocabulary of concern. It was the strongest language of condemnation available in the religious world Paul inhabited. He used it twice in two sentences. about himself. Hypothetically, if he were to preach differently, about an angel from heaven, if such a being were to appear with a different message, the natural response to reading those sentences for the first time is some version of who does this man think he is? And that is exactly the right question to sit with, because Paul anticipated it and answered it before anyone could ask. He spends the first 2 chapters of Galatians making a single argument that has nothing to do with circumcision or Torah or Abraham or any of the theological content that will come later. The argument is this: the gospel he preaches did not come from human beings. It did not come from the Jerusalem apostles. It did not come from any tradition handed down through institutional channels that a human authority could revoke or modify or override. He received it, he says, through a revelation of Jesus Christ. The claim to direct divine revelation has been made by an enormous number of people throughout history, and most of those claims turn out to be either self-deception or deliberate manipulation. Paul knows this. He is not naive about how the claim sounds, and he is not asking the Galatians to simply take his word for it. He is asking them to look at the evidence he is presenting. Evidence, he argues, is verifiable, and that he is staking his credibility on. The evidence is his own biography. He tells them what they already know about his past, his conduct in his former life in Judaism, his extreme zeal, the way he advanced beyond his contemporaries in his devotion to the traditions of his ancestors. He brings up the persecution specifically because it establishes something important. Nobody who was persecuting the church and then suddenly changed course is doing so because it was the socially advantageous thing to do. Nobody switches from the winning side to the losing side because they thought it through and decided the career prospects were better. He is saying, look at what I gave up. Look at what I was before. Look at what it cost me to change. Does that look like the behavior of someone who is telling you what you want to hear? After Damascus, he did not go to Jerusalem to be briefed by the people who had known Jesus. He went to Arabia. He spent 3 years working through what had happened before he consulted with anyone. When he finally did go to Jerusalem, he stayed only 15 days and saw only Peter and James. He is not a man who inherited his message from an institution and is now defending institutional authority. He is a man who received something and has been living inside it ever since. And here is where the double anathema makes sense. In a way, it cannot make sense if you read it as simple anger. Paul is not saying that he personally is above criticism or correction. He is saying that the gospel he preaches is not his. It does not belong to him in a way that would allow him to modify it or compromise it or trade pieces of it away to make people more comfortable. If he were to do that, even for good reasons, even under pressure from people he respected, even in response to an angelic vision, the anathema would fall on him as surely as it falls on anyone else who distorts the message. He is not exempting himself from accountability. He is including himself in the accountability structure. The standard is not what Paul thinks. The standard is the gospel itself, and nobody gets to revise it. Now look at what this means for the situation in Galatia. The people troubling the Galatian communities were not teaching something they had invented from nothing. They were teaching something with a claim to authority, a connection to Jerusalem, an argument from the scripture and tradition of Israel that had genuine weight. They could point to the covenant. They could point to Abraham. They could point to the practices that had defined the people of God for centuries. They had a case. What Paul is saying, with the anathema and with the autobiographical argument that follows it, is that the case does not matter. The source does not matter. The authority of the teachers does not matter. What matters is whether what is being taught is the gospel or a distortion of it. And if it is a distortion, it does not become acceptable because the people teaching it have impressive credentials or institutional backing or connections to the right people in Jerusalem. This is a radical position to take. It means that Paul is claiming the right to evaluate the teaching of people who have more obvious historical connections to Jesus than he does. It means he is saying that the criterion for truth in this case is not proximity to the source event, but faithfulness to what the source event actually means. And he is willing to say this publicly, in writing, in a letter that will be read aloud to the communities in Galatia, and then passed around and read in other communities too. But here is what the anathema is not. It is not the language of someone who enjoys conflict. Paul is not issuing condemnations because he has found a theologically justified outlet for his aggression. He is issuing them because he has watched, from a front row seat in Antioch, what happens when the boundaries of belonging get redrawn around a table. He watched Peter stand up and move to a different table. He watched Barnabas follow. He saw the faces of the people still sitting there. He knows what it costs to be on the wrong side of that kind of line. He caused that cost for other people. He stood at the edge of a crowd and held coats and let it happen. He is no longer willing to let it happen while he is in a position to say something about it. He is no longer willing to stand at the edge. The gospel is not his to give away, and it is not theirs to take. Paul does not abandon the scriptures of Israel to make his argument. He goes deeper into them. This is a point that is easy to miss when reading Galatians quickly, because the surface of the argument can look like Paul is setting the Hebrew scriptures aside in favor of something new. He is not doing that. He is doing something more careful and more precise. He is going back to the beginning of the story, before the parts his opponents are emphasizing, and arguing that what he finds there is the foundation that everything else has to be understood in light of. His opponents had Abraham too. That was the problem. Circumcision was not a practice invented at Sinai. It went all the way back to Abraham, the father of the whole story. God told Abraham to circumcise every male in his household as the sign of the covenant between them. This was not a minor ritual. This was the physical mark that said you are inside the story. This is how you know you belong to the covenant community that God is building through this particular family. If you wanted to argue that Gentile men needed to be circumcised to fully belong to the people of God, you did not have to reach far for your evidence. You went to Abraham, and there it was. Paul goes to Abraham too, but he goes to a different moment in the Abraham story. And he goes there with the precision of someone who has found the detail in the case that changes everything. The moment he goes to is in Genesis 15. Abraham is old. He and his wife Sarah have no children. God has been making promises to him about descendants and land and blessing, but the promises have not materialized in any visible way. Abraham asks God directly, "What will you give me, since I continue childless?" He is not challenging God out of faithlessness. He is sitting with the gap between what he has been promised and what he can see, and he is bringing that gap honestly into the conversation. God responds by taking Abraham outside and telling him to look at the sky, to count the stars if he can. Your descendants will be like that, God says. And then the text says something that Paul treats as the hinge on which the entire argument turns. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. That is the moment, not the circumcision, not the keeping of any law, not the demonstration of any particular practice or observance. Abraham believed, and God counted that belief as righteousness. Now here is why the sequence matters so much to Paul, and why he treats it as decisive rather than just interesting. The circumcision command comes in Genesis 17. The moment of credited righteousness comes in Genesis 15, 2 chapters earlier. In the chronology of the Abraham story, faith came before circumcision by what the text implies was a significant period of time. Paul draws the explicit conclusion that his opponents cannot easily escape. If Abraham was counted righteous before he was circumcised, then his righteousness was not dependent on his circumcision. The sign came later. The relationship came first, which means that what made Abraham right with God was not the mark he bore on his body, but the trust he placed in the promise he had been given. And if that is true for Abraham, the father of the story, then the pattern of how belonging works was established before circumcision entered the picture at all. Paul presses the argument further. He points out that God's promise to Abraham included the nations. The text of Genesis says that in Abraham all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Not just the descendants of Abraham, the nations, the people outside the covenant family. They were in the promise from the beginning, before the covenant sign existed, before the law was given, before any of the structures that would later define Israel as a distinct people had been put in place. Paul calls this the gospel preached in advance. God was telling Abraham something that pointed forward to what Christ would make available to everyone. The blessing of Abraham was always meant to reach beyond Abraham's biological descendants. The promise had a scope that the later structures of covenant identity, the circumcision, the Torah, the practices that marked Israel off from the nations, did not eliminate and were not designed to eliminate. Those structures came later. The promise came first. And here is where Paul makes the move that is most characteristic of the way trained Jewish thinkers in his world read Scripture. He argues that a later addition cannot override an earlier promise. If God made a covenant with Abraham on the basis of faith, and that covenant included blessing for the nations, then the Torah, which came 430 years after Abraham, cannot annul what was established in that earlier covenant. He uses a human analogy to make the point. Even in ordinary human affairs, he says, once a covenant has been ratified, you cannot add conditions to it or set it aside. If that is true of human agreements, how much more true of an agreement made by God? The Torah was not, on this reading, a revision of the Abrahamic covenant. It was an addition, serving a different purpose, operating at a different level of the story. It was not the foundation. The foundation was already laid in Genesis 15. When a man looked at the stars and believed a promise he could not yet see fulfilled. Now think about what this means for the Gentile believers in Galatia. Think again about that man who sat week after week in the same seat at the synagogue, always adjacent, always almost in but not quite, always waiting for something he could not quite reach. Paul is saying that this man was already in the oldest part of the story, not because he had taken any step that the law required, because the promise made to Abraham under the stars was made for him too. Before the sign existed, before the wall was built, before anyone decided which seat was the member seat and which was the visitor seat, he was in the promise before the promise had walls around it. The people pressing the Galatians to be circumcised were making an argument from Abraham. Paul is also making an argument from Abraham. But Paul is going further back in the Abraham story, to the moment before the sign existed, to the moment when what mattered was not a mark on the body, but a relationship with a promise. And he is saying that the Gentile believers, through faith in Christ, are already in that relationship. They are not joining something that began with circumcision. They are joining something that began with faith. And faith was there before circumcision was there. The table was set for everyone before the house was built. There is a sentence in Galatians that is easy to move past quickly because it is so dense and so strange that the mind almost slides off it before it can grip. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree." Sit with that for a moment before trying to understand it. The Messiah, cursed, hung on a tree. And that is somehow the mechanism by which the blessing of Abraham reaches the Gentiles. To understand why this sentence is in Galatians, and why Paul treats it as central rather than as an awkward detail to be explained away, you have to understand two things simultaneously: what crucifixion meant in the Roman world, and what the law said about someone who died that way. In the Roman Empire, crucifixion was reserved for the lowest categories of people: slaves who had committed serious offenses, violent criminals, rebels against Roman authority. It was not simply a method of execution. It was a method of execution specifically designed to communicate contempt. The Romans had other ways of killing people, methods that were faster and less agonizing. Crucifixion was chosen when the goal was not simply death, but humiliation. When the point was to make visible to everyone passing by that this person had been judged by Rome to be beneath the dignity of a normal death. A crucified man was displayed publicly. His suffering was prolonged. His body was left exposed, sometimes for days. He was being made into a message, a warning, a statement about what Rome did to people who stepped out of their assigned place. There was no such thing as a dignified crucifixion. There was no version of it that preserved the honor of the person being killed. If you died on a Roman cross, you died in the most shameful way that the most powerful empire in the world had devised. Now add the dimension from the Jewish scriptures that Paul reaches for. Deuteronomy 21 contains a provision about a specific kind of execution. If a man committed a crime worthy of death and was executed, and then his body was hung on a tree as a further public statement of his guilt and shame, the body had to be taken down before nightfall. The reason given is stark. A hanged man is cursed by God. Cursed by God. Which means that for a first-century Jewish person, the claim that the Messiah had been crucified was not just historically inconvenient. It was theologically catastrophic. The Messiah was supposed to be the one through whom God's blessing came to Israel, and through Israel to the world. A man who died on a Roman cross, under the curse of God, according to the plain reading of Deuteronomy, was, by definition, not that person. This was probably the single most powerful argument that people like Saul had against the Jesus movement before Damascus. You are claiming that a crucified man is the Messiah. But the law says a crucified man is cursed. The Messiah cannot be cursed by God. Therefore, your Messiah is not the Messiah. It is a clean argument. It has real force. And Paul does not escape it by reinterpreting the word cursed, or by arguing that the Deuteronomy passage does not really mean what it says. He goes the other direction entirely. Yes, he says, Christ was cursed. The law pronounces a curse on everyone hung on a tree. And Christ was hung on a tree. So Christ was under that curse. That is all exactly right. And here is what that means. For Paul, the law could name and expose transgression, but it could not, by itself, create the new reality he believed had arrived in Christ. There was a gap between what the law revealed and what the law could do about it. Christ, Polargis, entered into that gap, not because he had accumulated failures of his own, but because he was willing to stand in the place where the weight of human failure had accumulated, to absorb into himself what the law pronounced over the people who could not fully keep it. And by doing that, by becoming the curse on behalf of the people who were under it, he exhausted the curse. He took it to the place where it ended. And on the other side of that ending, the blessing of Abraham was free to flow outward to the nations the way it had always been promised it would. Now think about what this means for Paul's argument in Galatians. His opponents were saying that Gentiles needed to come under the law in order to be fully part of the covenant community. They needed to take on the system of practices that defined Israel as a distinct people. They needed to cross into the covenant through the covenant's own door. Paul is saying that the door they are pointing to is not the door they think it is. The door is the cross. The entry point is not circumcision. It is the place where the curse ended, the place where the man who had no curse of his own absorbed it on behalf of everyone who did. The Gentile believers in Galatia do not need to pass through the law to get to where the blessing is. They need to pass through Christ, and Christ is on the other side of the cross. This is why Paul, earlier in the letter, says that he has been crucified with Christ and no longer lives. But Christ lives in him. He is not using the language of the cross decoratively. He is saying that the logic of what happened at the cross is the logic he is living inside. The old certainties, the old boundaries, the old categories of who is in and who is out, the zealous protection of those categories that had defined his early life. All of it went into the curse with Christ. What came out was something different. A life that was not organized around earning a position or maintaining a boundary. a life that was given rather than achieved. He is trying to tell the Galatians that what was true for him at Damascus is available to them in the communities Paul had formed. The tree that was a symbol of shame became the point of entry, and you do not have to prove anything to walk through it. Picture a boy walking through the streets of a first-century city. He is maybe 8 years old, the son of a wealthy family. He is on his way to school, and he is not walking alone. Beside him is a man, an older slave assigned specifically to this task, to walk this boy to school every morning and bring him home every afternoon, to make sure he does not wander into the wrong neighborhood, to keep him out of trouble, to discipline him when he gets distracted, which is often because he is 8 years old, and the streets of an ancient city are full of things more interesting than whatever his tutor has planned for the day. This man is called a pedagogos. The word is usually translated as guardian or tutor or schoolmaster, but none of those English words quite captures what he actually was. He was not the teacher. He was not the father. He was the slave who walked the child to school, present every day, necessary every day, but not the destination, not the relationship that mattered most, not the one who would be there when the boy grew up and took his place as the heir of everything his father had built. His job had a beginning and it had an end. When the boy came of age, when the period of minority was over and the child was recognized as an adult heir, the pedagogos stepped back, not because he had done anything wrong, because the period he was designed to manage was over. Paul reaches for this image to describe the role of the Torah in the history of God's people. And before we follow him into that argument, there is something that has to be said clearly, because this passage in Galatians has been misread in ways that have caused real damage for a very long time. Paul is not saying that Torah was bad. He is not saying that the Jewish tradition was a mistake, or that centuries of covenant faithfulness were wasted effort. He is writing specifically to Gentile communities about whether Gentile men need to take on circumcision and Torah observance to be fully part of the community of Christ. That is the specific question he is addressing. His argument is not that Jewish people should abandon Torah. His argument is that Gentiles do not need to come through Torah to enter what Christ has opened. The pedagogos imagery is about the role of the law in the broad sweep of what God has been doing across human history, not a verdict on the value of Jewish life and practice. That distinction matters enormously. With that said, here is what Paul is actually arguing. The Torah, he says, was added because of transgressions. It was given to make transgressions visible, to define clearly what the failure looked like, to hold the community accountable to a standard that could be named and measured during the period between the promise made to Abraham and the fulfillment of that promise in Christ. It was not the foundation. It was the structure built on top of the foundation to manage the period of waiting. Like the pedagogos walking the child to school, it served a real and necessary function. It kept the community together. It kept the promise visible. It gave shape to the life of the people who were carrying the covenant forward through centuries of exile and occupation and uncertainty. But it was not the goal. It was the guardian appointed to bring the community to the goal. Christ is the goal. With the arrival of Christ, Paul argues, the period of minority is over. The heir has come of age. The pedagogos has served his function, and the function is complete. And what comes with the coming of age is not a new set of requirements to demonstrate maturity. What comes is something the pedagogos could never provide, something that no external system of rules and requirements can provide, no matter how good or how necessary those rules were in their time. What comes is the Spirit of the Son. Paul says something in this section that stops everything else. God sent his Son, he writes, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. That word Abba is Aramaic. It is the everyday word a Jewish child used to address a father. Intimate and immediate, in a way that the more formal word for father is not. Paul drops it into a Greek letter without translating it, as if the word itself carries something that translation cannot fully preserve. It is the word of a child calling out to a parent who is genuinely present and genuinely safe. And Paul is saying that the Spirit of Christ, living in the Galatian believers, cries out with that word, not the formal address of a servant petitioning a master, the immediate, intimate word of a child who knows they are at home. The heir does not call out to a guardian with that word. The heir calls out to a father. Now Paul turns directly to the Galatians, and what he says has an edge that is hard to miss. He says, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world? How can you want to be enslaved to them all over again? He watches them adopting a calendar of religious observances, marking out the sacred time of the Jewish year. And he is troubled in the specific way of someone who sees people he loves grabbing hold of something that will not save them from what they are afraid of. Because he understands what they are afraid of. The same thing the man in the visitor seat at the synagogue was afraid of every week. That the belonging is not real. That they are not fully in. That something is missing in the accounting. Some box unchecked. Some mark unrecorded that will place them back outside the door they thought they had walked through. Paul is saying that fear is a lie, and the sign they are considering taking on to address that fear will not address it. Because the fear it is trying to solve is built on a misunderstanding of what has already happened. They are sons. They are daughters. They have the spirit that cries Abba. No guardian is necessary for the person who is already home. Start with one person, not a category, not a theological concept. One person. Standing in a community in Galatia sometime in the middle of the 1st century, hearing Paul's letter read aloud for the first time. She is not Jewish. She came to the community through one of the Greek-speaking synagogues in the city. Drawn in, gradually, over months. Then years. She heard about Jesus through Paul. She believed. She became part of this community where the old lines seemed not to matter the way they had always mattered everywhere else she had ever been. And now there are new teachers in town. And the new teachers are saying that her faith is real but her standing is incomplete. That there is something her husband needs to do. Something that involves his body. Something that will mark him in a way she cannot be marked. Before they are truly, fully, without any remaining asterisk, part of the people of God, she is sitting in that room, listening to Paul's letter being read. And then she hears this. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. 12 words in the original Greek. And in that room, on that day, those 12 words were not a theological proposition. They were a description of her, of the people sitting around her, of what this community was supposed to be, and what was at risk of being taken away from them. This sentence has been doing more work for longer than almost any other sentence in the history of Christian thought. And to understand it, you have to start where Paul started, with belonging, with the specific question of who is fully in the community formed around Christ. The 3 pairs Paul uses are not random. They represent the 3 most fundamental divisions in the social world of the 1st century Roman Empire. Jew and Greek was the most religiously loaded division. It was the line between the covenant people and everyone else. Between those who had the law and those who did not. Between the people who understood themselves as having a particular relationship with the God of the universe and the people who stood outside that relationship. Slave and free was the most practically consequential division. Somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the population of the Roman Empire was enslaved. This was not a minor social distinction. It was the organizing principle of the entire economic world. The line between slave and free was as total as any social division the ancient world had produced. Male and female, which Paul phrases slightly differently from the other 2. Using a construction that echoes the Genesis creation account, was the most universal division. Every human society that has ever existed has made distinctions based on sex. Paul is reaching to the deepest level of human social organization when he includes it. And he says that in Christ, these three pairs are no longer the operative categories. He is not saying that Jewish people stop being Jewish, or that enslaved people are immediately freed, or that biological sex disappears. He is saying something more targeted than a general announcement that human differences no longer matter. He is saying that in the community formed around Christ, these categories no longer determine who has access to the full reality of what God has made available. They do not determine who is more in or less in. They do not create a hierarchy of belonging in which some people are full members and others are partial members or members in waiting. That is a radical claim. It was radical in the first century, and it did not stay in the first century. In the early 19th century in the United States, the question of slavery was tearing the country apart, and both sides of that argument were reading the same Bible. The abolitionists reached for Galatians 3:28. There is neither slave nor free. How could a community that claimed to follow Paul maintain an institution that Paul himself had declared irrelevant to the question of who belongs? The sentence was a challenge planted in the foundation of every argument for the Christian acceptability of slavery. The defenders of slavery also reached for Galatians 3:28. They argued that Paul was speaking about spiritual equality only, about the standing of souls before God in the matter of salvation, not about the organization of human society. In Christ, they said, a slave and a free person have equal standing before God. But that spiritual equality does not translate into a requirement to restructure the social order. One sentence, two readings, generations of people on both sides of one of the most consequential moral arguments in American history, both convinced they were reading it correctly. What does that tell us? The sentence is clear in its direction, even if communities have argued for centuries over the range of its implications. Paul is saying that in the community of Christ, none of these categories determine who belongs. That principle has a direction, and the history of communities that have tried to honor that direction while also maintaining institutions that contradict it is the history of a principle working its way through human resistance over centuries. Never fully contained, never fully applied, always pressing against the limits of what any given generation was willing to let it mean. 2,000 years of Christian history suggest that quoting it is considerably easier than living it. But the sentence is still there, still doing its work, still asking the communities that claim to live inside it whether they have actually built their life together around what it says. Go back to that woman in Galatia, sitting in that room, hearing these words for the first time. She did not need a theologian to explain the implications. She needed someone to say it out loud, in a letter, in front of everyone. In a community that was being told she and her husband were not quite fully in, Paul said it, and the saying of it mattered before anyone had worked out all the implications. It still does. There is a sentence near the beginning of the 5th chapter of Galatians that is 5 words long in English, and that Paul clearly intends as the summary of everything he has been building toward. For freedom Christ has set us free. 5 words, and they have been misread more consistently and more consequentially than almost anything else Paul ever wrote. Not because they are ambiguous, because they use a word that carries so much cultural weight in the modern world, particularly in America, that the word itself becomes the obstacle to understanding what the sentence actually means. Freedom. In the American imagination, freedom is one of the founding concepts of the national identity. It is written into the documents that establish the country. It is invoked in political speeches across every part of the spectrum. It is the word on the lips of people who hold completely incompatible visions of what a good society looks like. Because almost everyone agrees that freedom is good, even when they cannot agree on anything else. The dominant meaning of freedom in American culture is something like this: the absence of external constraint on individual choice. You are free when nobody is telling you what to do. You are free when you get to decide for yourself how to live. You are free when the only limits on your behavior are the limits you have chosen to accept. This is a coherent idea. It has produced real goods in the world. But it is not what Paul means when he writes that for freedom, Christ has set us free. Paul's freedom is not the absence of constraint. It is the presence of something. Specifically, it is the presence of a relationship that has removed the need to earn your place in it. Think about what the Galatians were being pressed to do. The people troubling them were saying, "You have faith, and that is good." But faith alone is not sufficient for full membership in the covenant community. You need to add to the faith. You need to take on the mark. You need to demonstrate your commitment through the practices that have always defined the people of God. You need to show, in a way that can be verified, that you are willing to do what the covenant requires. What that message was producing in the Galatian communities, underneath the theological argument, was a particular kind of anxiety. The anxiety of people who are not sure they have done enough. The anxiety of people who are measuring themselves against a standard and wondering whether they measure up. The anxiety of people who have been told they are in, but are being handed new evidence that they might not be. That anxiety is what Paul is addressing when he talks about freedom. He is not talking about freedom from responsibility. The very next verse makes that crystal clear. He says, "Do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." The freedom he is describing is freedom from the particular burden of having to earn your position. Freedom from the exhausting and ultimately impossible project of proving yourself adequate to the standard that will make you acceptable. Freedom from the treadmill of performance that never quite reaches the speed where you can be confident you are keeping up. Most people carry some version of this burden. The sense that you are not quite enough. That the acceptance you have received is provisional, conditional, dependent on your continued performance. That if people knew everything about you, really knew, they would revise their assessment. That the belonging you have found could be taken away if you fail to maintain it. Paul is saying that this burden is precisely what Christ has addressed. Not by lowering the standard. Not by pretending that the failure and the inadequacy are not real, but by doing something about the gap at the cross, in the way he described in the chapter about the curse on the tree. The Galatians have been set free from that burden. They do not have to take on circumcision to shore up the security of their position. Their position is not held in place by circumcision. It is held in place by something that circumcision cannot add to and uncircumcision cannot take away from. And because their position is secure, because the belonging is real and not conditional on continued performance, they are free to do something that people who are still on the treadmill of earning cannot fully do. They are free to love. This is the turn that Paul makes in verse 13. And it is the turn that reveals what the freedom is actually for. He does not say, "For freedom Christ has set you free, so now you can organize your life however you choose." He says, "For freedom Christ has set you free, so through love serve one another." The freedom is not the destination. It is the condition that makes the destination possible. Here is what he means by that. A person who is serving others in order to earn their place is not really free to serve. They are serving to protect themselves. They are generous when generosity costs less than the loss of approval would cost. They are patient when impatience would damage the relationship they need to maintain. They are kind when kindness is the safest strategy. Everything they do for others is shadowed by the calculation of what it produces for them, even when they are not consciously aware of making that calculation. A person who already has their place, who is not serving to earn something they do not have, who is not being patient in order to keep something they are afraid of losing. That person is free to serve in a completely different way. They can give without counting the cost because the cost is not coming out of a fund they need to protect. They can be patient without resentment because their patience is not a strategic expenditure. They can be kind without calculation because there is nothing they need from the transaction. The difference between those two ways of being in the world is not a small one. It produces two entirely different kinds of people, two entirely different kinds of communities. The community the people troubling the Galatians were trying to build was a community organized around demonstration. Show your commitment through the mark. Prove your belonging through the practices. Demonstrate your sincerity through the observances. That community would always be a community of people measuring themselves and each other. A community where the question of whether you are in or out is always, at some level, still open. The community Paul was trying to build was something different. A community where the question of whether you are in is settled. Where the belonging is not a reward for performance, but the ground from which performance grows. Where love is possible in a real and not just a technical sense, because the people doing the loving are not serving their own need for security when they give themselves to each other. He ends the argument about freedom with an image that is almost violent in its directness. He says the whole law is fulfilled in a single word: love your neighbor as yourself. Not observe the calendar, not maintain the dietary practices, not bear the covenant sign. Love your neighbor as yourself. That is the thing the law was always pointing toward. The human reality that all the structures and requirements and carefully maintained boundaries were designed to protect and cultivate. And if the community is biting and devouring one another, as Paul says the Galatians apparently are, if they are tearing themselves apart over the question of circumcision and belonging and who is really in, then all the external observances in the world are producing the opposite of what they were supposed to produce. You are free, Paul says. You have been set free. Real freedom, not the freedom of no one telling you what to do. The freedom of knowing that your place is not up for grabs, that you are not one bad week away from losing it, that the belonging is real and it is yours. And it does not depend on your ability to maintain a performance that no one can maintain forever. From that place, the command to love your neighbor is not another item on the list of things you have to do to stay in. It is the natural overflow of a life that is not constantly working to protect itself. The freedom Paul is describing is not freedom from love. It is freedom for it. Paul has spent the letter talking about belonging. Who gets to be in, what the entry requirements are, whether there is a sign that proves you are inside the community, whether the lines that have always defined the people of God still operate the same way they did before Christ. And now, in the 5th chapter, he turns to the question that is underneath all of those questions. Not who gets to be in, but what being in produces. Not the entry point, but what you find on the other side of it. Not the door, but what the community looks like when the door is open to everyone. He frames the answer using a distinction between two words that are both usually translated into English as works or deeds, but that carry very different weight in what he is saying. Works of the flesh and fruit of the Spirit. Before we can hear what he means by either of those phrases, we have to clear away a misunderstanding that has attached itself to the word flesh in particular. A misunderstanding so persistent that it has shaped the way millions of people have read this passage for centuries. In ordinary modern usage, when people hear the word flesh in a religious context, they hear a reference to the body, to physical desire, to sexual behavior specifically. The flesh is where temptation lives. The flesh is what needs to be controlled and disciplined and denied. The battle between spirit and flesh is, in this reading, a battle between the spiritual part of a person and the physical part. Paul does not mean that. Look at the list he gives when he catalogues the works of the flesh. Sexual immorality is on the list. But so are idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissension, division, envy. The majority of the items on the list have nothing to do with the body or physical desire. They are social failures. They are the ways that human communities tear themselves apart. They are what happens when the self-protective, self-promoting, self-justifying impulse in human beings gets to run a community without any counterweight. Flesh, in Paul's usage, is not the body opposed to the spirit. It is the orientation of a human life that is organized around the self as the center. The life that is lived in constant competition with other people for position and status and approval. The life that is always calculating what each interaction produces for me, what each relationship costs me, whether I am getting what I deserve. That kind of life produces a very particular set of outcomes. Enmity, strife, jealousy, rivalries, dissension, division. Look at what the Galatian communities were doing. They were fighting over circumcision. They were fighting over whether Gentile men were full members or second-class members. They were biting and devouring one another. As Paul says directly, a community that was supposed to demonstrate something new about how human beings could live together was producing, in concentrated form, exactly the outcomes that the flesh produces in any community organized around the self-protection of its members. Then he lists the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. The word fruit is not decorative. Paul chose it carefully, and the choice is doing significant work. A fruit is not something you manufacture. It is something that grows, and that distinction, as simple as it sounds, carries the weight of the entire argument. When you perform a work, you are the agent. You decide to do it. You execute it. The work exists because you made it exist. When fruit grows, something else is the agent. The tree produces the fruit, not by effort or decision, but by nature, by being connected to the soil and the water and the sun that it needs. You do not tell an apple tree to make apples. You plant it in the right place. You give it what it needs, and the apples come. Paul is describing the kind of communal life the Spirit makes possible when the community is no longer organized around performing belonging. He is not talking primarily about private spiritual wellness. He is talking about what happens between people when the anxiety of proving themselves has been removed from the equation. A community of people who know they are already in, who are not using their relationships to build the security they are afraid they do not have, who are not measuring each other against the standard that determines who is more in or less in. That community has the conditions in which love can actually grow, in which joy is a shared reality rather than a private achievement, in which patience is the natural response of people who are not in competition with each other. The fruit is not the goal that you aim at and try to produce. It is the evidence that you are actually living in the freedom that Paul has been describing throughout the letter. This has significant implications for how you read everything that came before it in Galatians. Paul's argument against requiring circumcision from the Galatians is not just an argument about the entry point. It is an argument about what the entry point produces. A community organized around demonstrating belonging through visible signs and required performances will always be a community that produces strife and rivalry and division. Because the performance orientation is the flesh orientation. You cannot build the community Paul is describing on a foundation that requires everyone to keep proving they deserve to be there. The people troubling the Galatians were not just adding a requirement to the process. They were replacing the ground from which fruit grows with a surface on which performance happens. Paul knows from his own experience what performance-oriented communities produce. He spent years as one of the most devoted performers in the most performance-oriented religious context of his world. He tracked every boundary. He enforced every line. He was zealous for the system, and the system made him dangerous. He is not going to recommend that way of organizing a life. Not to the Galatians. Not to anyone. He has felt what it is like to be welcomed by someone who had every reason not to welcome him. He has felt what it is like to be called brother by someone whose community he had been destroying. He has felt the particular quality of belonging that does not depend on what you have done or what you will do. The belonging that is simply given. From that place, The command to love your neighbor is not a performance requirement. It is not another item on the list of things you have to do to stay in. It is what grows when the anxiety stops. Not because you decided to grow it, because the conditions finally allowed it. Paul is almost done with the letter. He has made the argument about Abraham and the promise that preceded the law. He has made the argument about the cross and the curse, and the way the blessing of Abraham reached the Gentiles through the most shameful moment in the Roman execution system. He has made the argument about the pedagogos and the heir who has come of age. He has made the argument about freedom and fruit, and what a community looks like when it is organized around the Spirit rather than around the performance of belonging. And now, in the final verses, he does something that is either the most important move in the entire letter or the most easily overlooked. Depending on how fast you read, he steps back from the entire argument, not to retreat from it, not to qualify it, but to place it in a frame that is larger than the argument itself, a frame that changes what the argument is actually about. He says neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but new creation. Read that sentence again slowly. He has spent the entire letter arguing against circumcision as a requirement for Gentile belonging. He has made that argument with the full weight of his training and his experience and his understanding of the Scripture of Israel. He has been passionate and direct and willing to make enemies over the point. And now he says it is not about circumcision or uncircumcision. This is not a contradiction. It is a clarification of what the argument was always actually about. Paul was never trying to establish uncircumcision as the new badge of belonging. He was never trying to replace one system of external markers with another. He was never saying the old community was defined by circumcision, and the new community is defined by the absence of circumcision. And now everyone needs to make sure they are on the right side of the new line. That would have been trading one performance system for another. That would have been building a new wall where the old wall stood, just facing the other direction. What Paul is pointing toward is something that makes the wall itself irrelevant, not by tearing it down and building a new one, by stepping into a reality in which the question the wall was answering is no longer the question. New creation. The phrase comes from the prophetic tradition of Israel. Isaiah used it. The prophets who imagined the future that God was moving toward used it. It was the language of something completely new. Not a renovation of what existed, but a beginning, so complete that it did not merely modify the previous reality, but brought into existence something that had not been there before. Paul is saying that the arrival of Christ initiated something of that magnitude. Not a reform of the existing system, not an upgrade of the covenant of Israel. A new creation, a new ordering of the relationship between God and human beings. And through that, a new ordering of the relationships between human beings with each other. In new creation terms, the question of whether you have the covenant sign of the old creation community is not the question. The question is not which side of the circumcision line you stand on. The question is whether you are living inside the reality that Christ has brought into existence. And that reality, as Paul has been arguing throughout the letter, is characterized not by external markers, but by the Spirit. Not by performance, but by fruit. Not by the anxiety of earning your place, but by the freedom of knowing that your place has been given. Now sit with what this means for the specific situation in Galatia. The people troubling the Galatian communities were offering them a way to secure their belonging through a visible sign. Circumcision would put them on the right side of the line. It would make their membership legible to the broader Jewish world. It would connect them to the ancient covenant in a way that could be verified and seen. Paul is saying that in new creation terms, the line they are being told to cross is not the relevant line. The relevant reality is the one that came into existence when Christ was raised from the dead, when the Spirit was poured out, when the blessing of Abraham began flowing to the nations through faith rather than through covenant membership defined by a physical sign. Getting circumcised would not move them into new creation. They are already in it. If they are living by the Spirit, if they are walking in the freedom that Christ has opened, if they are producing fruit rather than performing belonging, getting circumcised would, in fact, move them in the wrong direction. Not because circumcision is evil, but because the act of taking it on as a requirement, the acceptance of the premise that it is necessary for full membership, would be an act of denying the reality of new creation. It would be saying the new thing is not quite new enough. We still need the markers of the old thing to be sure. Paul is not willing to say that. He cannot say that, because he has experienced new creation from the inside, and he knows the difference between the reality of it and the performance of belonging that was his entire life before Damascus. He ends the theological argument of the letter with a blessing that carries the quiet weight of someone who has said everything there is to say. Peace and mercy to all who walk by this rule, and to the Israel of God. And then, before the final words, one more statement that ties everything together. Neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but new creation. He has said it already. He says it again, because some things are worth saying twice, and this is one of them. New creation is not only a theological concept, it is the community where the table that Peter walked away from in Antioch becomes real and stays real, where the people who were told they were not enough discover they were always enough, where the man who held the coats at an execution has become the man who writes, in his own hand, that there is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. The argument about circumcision was never the goal. The goal was always what comes after the argument is settled. The goal was always communities where the question of who is in and who is out has been replaced by the question of what love requires here. In this place, with these people, in this moment, the goal was always the table where everyone can sit down. The table that Peter walked away from. The table that Paul has been fighting to get back to since he watched it empty out in front of his eyes in Antioch. New creation is not somewhere else. It is a community where that table is real. And Paul, who has been writing this letter with everything he has, is almost out of words. Almost. He has one more thing to say. Near the end of the letter, Paul does something he almost never does. He takes the pen himself. In the ancient world, letter writing was typically a collaborative process. The author dictated. A trained scribe wrote. The author would sometimes add a personal note at the end in his own hand. A few words to authenticate the letter and signal that what the scribe had written represented the author's genuine intentions. Paul almost always used a scribe. At the end of his letter to the Romans, the scribe identifies himself, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter. Greet you in the Lord. Paul mentions it at the end of other letters too. The shift from dictation to personal handwriting as a mark of authentication. But in Galatians, when he takes the pen, he does not simply sign off. He calls attention to what the handwriting looks like. See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. The letters are large. He wants them to notice that. He is not apologizing for it. He is pointing to it as if the size of the letters is itself part of the message. Why were the letters large? The text does not say. Some scholars point to the reference earlier in the letter where Paul reminds the Galatians that they would have torn out their eyes and given them to him when he first came to them sick. This has led many readers to conclude that Paul had significant eye trouble. Perhaps a chronic condition, perhaps something that made writing physically difficult. If he could not see well, large letters would have been necessary just to form the words at all. Others suggest that the large letters are simply the natural result of someone who spends most of his life dictating rather than writing, whose handwriting is unpracticed and therefore larger and less controlled than that of a trained scribe. Still others suggest that the large letters are deliberate, a visual emphasis to match the emotional weight of what he is about to say. The way someone might raise their voice at the end of an argument to make sure the final point lands. We do not know. We only know that he writes it. that he tells the Galatians he is writing it, and that the letter ends with those large, imperfect, personally written letters on the page. And then he makes his final argument. He goes back to the people troubling the Galatian communities one last time. He says they want to make a good showing in the flesh. They want to compel circumcision so they will not face pressure for the cross of Christ. They want the Galatians to boast in their circumcision so that the troublers can boast in the Galatians' flesh. And then he says, "As for me, I will never boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world." That sentence is the key to understanding everything Paul has written in this letter. He is not boasting in his argument. He is not boasting in his superior understanding of the Scripture. He is not boasting in having been right about Antioch, or right about circumcision, or right about Abraham. He is boasting in the cross, the place of shame, the tree where the curse landed, the point in the story where everything that Paul had built his life around, the certainty, the zeal, the performance of righteousness, died. He was crucified to the world that organized itself around who was in and who was out, around performance and markers and the carefully maintained boundaries of belonging. That world is dead to him, not because he triumphed over it, because he went through the cross with Christ and came out on the other side. And on the other side the world looks different. Then, in what reads like the last breath of a man who has said everything he had to say, he writes the sentence that echoes the 3rd chapter and ties the whole letter together. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but new creation. And then the benediction, "The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit." Brothers, that word lands differently at the end of this letter than it would at the end of any other. Ananias walked into a room in Damascus where Saul was sitting in the dark, the man who had been hunting his community, the man who had been traveling to that very city to arrest people like him. And the first word he said was brother. Paul has carried that word his whole life since. It is not a casual greeting for him. It is a claim. It is the claim that the belonging created by Christ runs deeper than every other category that divides human beings. Deeper than Jew and Greek. Deeper than slave and free. Deeper than the lines that Saul of Tarsus spent his early years enforcing with violence. He ends the most urgent letter he ever wrote with that word. Brothers, now picture the scene in Galatia when this letter arrived. The community gathered, as communities in that world always gathered when a letter came from someone significant, to hear it read aloud. They sat in someone's house, a room full of people who had found belonging together in a world that had not offered them easy belonging. And someone stood up and began to read. They heard the missing thank you and understood immediately that something was different about this letter. They heard the astonishment and the double anathema and the argument about Abraham and the curse on the tree and the guardian and the heir. They heard the sentence about neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female. They heard about freedom and fruit and the community that love makes possible. And then they heard the reader reach the place where Paul took the pen himself, where the handwriting changed, where the letters got large. The question that the letter had been asking from the first word to the last was hanging in the air over all of them. Can you belong to God without becoming someone else first? The letter does not close that question. 2,000 years after it was written, communities all over the world are still fighting over it, still drawing lines and erasing them and drawing new ones, still arguing about who is in and who is out and what the sign of belonging looks like and whether the table is big enough. But Paul's answer is there in the letter. From the missing thank you to the large letters at the end, the table is big enough. It has always been big enough. The promise was made to Abraham under stars he could not count. Before there was a sign, before there was a law, before there was a wall of any kind around the people who would carry the promise forward. The promise was for the nations, all of them, including the people in Galatia who had been told they were almost in but not quite, almost right but not fully, almost acceptable but still needing one more thing to complete the paperwork of belonging. They did not need one more thing. They were already in the promise. Now go back to where we started. A young man standing at the edge of a crowd, holding a pile of coats, watching a man die, completely certain he was on the right side. He was wrong about all of it. And the way he discovered he was wrong was not through a better argument or a more careful reading of the scripture. It was through an encounter on a road to Damascus that knocked him flat and took away his sight and put him in a room where the first person to call him brother was someone he had been hunting. That encounter gave him something that his zeal had never given him, something that all the certainty and all the boundary keeping and all the careful performance of righteousness had never produced. It gave him the experience of being welcomed when he had no right to expect it, of being called brother when he deserved to be called enemy, of belonging to something he had been trying to destroy. And that experience became the ground of everything he wrote for the rest of his life. When he tells the Galatians that they belong, that the distance has been closed, that they do not have to become someone else to be inside the story. He is writing from the inside of that experience. He is not constructing a theological position. He is describing something he has lived. He knows what it costs to be told you are not enough. He caused that cost for other people. He cannot undo what he did to Stephen. He cannot give back to the families he tore apart the years he took from them. But he can write. He can argue. He can take the pen into his own hands when the argument requires it and press the letters into the page with whatever force his hands still have. He can tell the Galatians that the people who were saying they were not enough were wrong. And he can close the letter with the word that changed his life when he heard it in the dark in Damascus, spoken by a man who had every reason not to say it. Brothers, the letter ends there. The question it carries does not. Can you belong to God without becoming someone else first? The answer was in the promise before Abraham could count the stars. Yes, you already do.